So if you were to describe a newspaper and say, well, look, you read, front page, the big news of the day, and then you try to explain that information by by describing the chemistry of the ink in the paper. You don't describe the meaning of the words on the page. But that level of accounting of the paper and ink in a materially scientifically correct sense does not explain the information in the paper and the ink. And so they would say, well, look, there has to be design involved. There has to be some agent, some will involved in giving the information to the DNA. Now, Francis Crick also sort of agrees with this, but he just believed it was aliens. It was called panspermia. And one of the things that the New Atheists didn't really like about the movie Expelled with Ben Stein is Dawkins admitted, yeah, maybe it's panspermia. And then he asks Dawkins, well, how is that non-intelligent design? And it is. Yeah. It is. Now, the difference is it an alien or God? Now, if it's an alien, he only kicks the can down the road because how did that life form develop, its specified complexity of the DNA code? And so that's the other argument. There's the DNA code that natural selection is working on isn't explained by any natural process.
Right. Yeah. And also the good example with the library and the newspaper. We just like evolutionary scientists would just imagine that there's randomness and sort of like a plan emerges, but they don't quite know what the plan is, right? They just look at patterns and think that's some sort of how it works out, but it's not. It doesn't need to be the plan, right? It's basically somebody who never read a newspaper looks at the letters on the newspaper and thinks it's some strange code, or some pattern that they use for decorative purposes, right? Maybe somebody in a million years finds a preserved room, and the people just started to paint the walls, and so they have old newspapers everywhere, and then as the researchers conclude, yeah, see, those people use those strange papers with letters on it as a decorative purpose, right? So it's very difficult to really ascertain what it all means, and that's a problem. That's a problem that evolutionary scientists have. To the question whether order cannot emerge from whether information cannot emerge internally, I think that was the point, right? That you always need some internal.
Yeah.
Well, that goes back to the order argument. There can be mutations that make a protein better at certain things, right? There are mutations that make a protein not just weaker but also stronger and faster. That can also happen, right? And then one would imagine that the organism with that kind of mutation has an advantage because it can build muscle faster and then can run faster or something like that. But so that would be something where you would say, okay, there's some positive effect, maybe some information emerging from non-information. It could be that you have random processes that are then stabilized at a certain level and then enhanced later on, right? Because now these animals can run faster, and then the offspring can run faster, and they can compete better for resources and so on and so forth. The whole natural selection. But once again, you basically like from a different side, from different parts of the ecosystem, that mutation may be bad for them, right? Maybe a negative mutation for them, right? So it's always a question from where you look at the whole system.
Is that it? Because I was going to add another layer of.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to add another layer that would help here. Okay, so going back to just to recap, Craig, we said that the argument that was sort of implied or at least stated without fully unpacking by the two creationists was one, that the time dimension, you can't observe any of this. So whatever you want to call this explanation, it's not a scientific explanation since observation is not a part of what we're talking about. The second one was the information, right? The idea that there's genetic information in the genetic code that cannot come from a natural process, right? You can't appeal to chemistry or physics as underlying processes, because of course biology sits on top of chemistry and physics, and none of those laws give rise to information in the interacting with them. So we have to have a designer. And the third point which again, it's implied. So if you're not familiar with the literature, it's a little tricky. The third point is, even if we allow for speciation and environmental factors to select for or against certain traits, the problem then becomes, how do you select for something that isn't there? So for example, you could select, you could delete information like cave fish losing their eyes, right? That was a mutation that, because if your eyes consume energy and you don't need them, and you're in a cave situation like that, it's more efficient and adaptive to lose those eyes because it's just wasted energy, right? But if you put those fish back out into the open air and open streams and rivers, they won't get their eyes back. It's not going to go the other way. They're not going to get their eyes back. But then, second of all, let's look at the proposed transition from fish to amphibians, right? Well, lungfish have lungs, amphibians have lungs, but there's a whole gene sequence that needs to be selected for. But if you're a fish without lungs, how is that selected for if it's not already there?
Well, one explanation for that could be that you have, I mean, point mutations are not the only source of mutations that are there, right? So basically, we have a lot of viral DNA in us, for example. So basically, in many cases, whole parts of proteins get exchanged and get transported through viruses, for example. So viruses could be one evolutionary motor. They didn't discuss it back then because I think they didn't discuss it in science in general yet. But basically, a virus has certain genes on board, and not all viruses are harmful, right? So viruses attack us or get into our system, and then they integrate their DNA into our DNA. And most of the time, we don't realize anything of that, right? But that's a way to transmit larger molecule, larger, even whole fragments of proteins from one species to another. That would be an explanation. And the cave fish that you take out of the cave, and they will not grow back eyes, but they may grow back other ways of sensing the light, right? So basically, but only if that would give them an evolutionary advantage. It's a little more difficult to use this to argue why so complexly developed organisms like humans can emerge evolutionarily from lower organisms, even on a long enough time scale, right? Because you have to have more than just a few changes to make an eye.
Well, let me put it this way: if you have let's use a non-biological system, let's use a book, or maybe a line of computer code. If you keep copying it and don't have any other human interference, right? Maybe you run an algorithm just keeps copying the code. According to, again, information theory, one of two things will happen: the code will be preserved, or the code will be degraded. The information in the code, rather, but you won't get new information because you don't have a sender. And so, to even have the new information for the biological organism to have the environment select, they would have to have a sender, and there isn't a sender. So how does the fish get the lung gene to be selected for? Because there's no information being set in. And then furthermore, the other argument would be that it's copying, right? And it's a copying. You might get like a mutation, might get like 6 fingers instead of just 5, right? But it's copying what's already there. It's not giving you something new. Even if you get an addition, right, and an eye loss is a subtraction, but even if it's an addition, so you have like 6 fingers and 6 toes, or 2 heads, like certain mutants, right? You're not getting something new. You're getting a copy, right? See the argument there. It's like you're just copying it. Even if you get more of it, it's not like you got something different. You just got more of the same.
Right. The argument would be that gills and lungs are very similar, and they're just better adapted. One point is better adapted to the water, and the other is better adapted to the air. And then you only need a very few changes to transform gills into lungs and backs. Lungs are not really, and even if an organism doesn't have lungs anymore, those lung genes are sort of like still hidden inside the DNA, just aren't switched on. And you could also make the argument that you don't need so many changes because a few changes during early embryonic development will compound later on, right? So what looks like a big difference later on may only have been a very small difference early. But the point remains that you it if you look at any organs that highly complex organisms have or that humans have, I mean, at one point you use them as some form of blueprint, and at one point, how can you make the blueprint if you don't have a blueprint for the blueprint, right?
Yeah. So there's another point that you got close to, and I want to double back on because this will help you explain the position better. Now, this argument was made after the debate. So this debate was 1986. But Michael Behe, he's actually intelligent design. He wouldn't call himself a creationist, I don't think. Not like, say, these two men. Though the Darwinists would, so I guess it doesn't really matter. There's a concept called irreducible complexity where, according to Behe, uh, biological systems that, according to him, cannot be explained by evolution because their component parts are so interdependent that removing any one part renders the system non-functional. So he's coming at this from an engineering perspective, saying, well, if you remove even one part, one genome, the entire mechanism is non-functional. So then if it's non-functional, until you develop the new trait, there is no biological adaptivity. But so then you wouldn't actually go that far in the first place because it's a non-functioning system until you have all the parts right. But if it develops gradually and you don't have all the parts at once, like gills to lungs, then you have some sort of intermediate thing that isn't a gill, it isn't a lung, and therefore it wouldn't be adaptive.
Right. Once again, an evolutionary biologist would make the argument that there are mutations that are called hypomorph, meaning that if you take one gene away, there's still a second gene that can account for the lack of the first one, right? That's called redundant genes, and that's something that is especially in species like some fish that have quadrupled their DNA. So basically, you have 4 copies of many genes. They can basically be very difficult to study because you can't knock out one gene because you still have a lot of other copies that compensate for that. If you look at the connection of a cell, a so-called focal adhesion that a cell makes to the ground, right? Maybe your muscle make a connection to the tendons to keep it on the bone, right? So on the molecular level, those connections are like 200 to 250 different proteins in there. So there are some proteins that are more important, some genes that are more important, and other genes that we can just let go, right? So basically it's more like it's not like one perfectly functional mechanism is the focal adhesion or any other molecular pathway is not one very specific thing where when you take one protein away the whole thing falls apart. No, you take the specific things away that are really important to drive this, the whole thing falls apart. But there's plenty of proteins you can take apart, so nothing happens. There's some buffer in evolution, but still, coming back to the homology argument, I don't see how that would deny the existence of a creator spirit. Maybe it just expresses itself in a different way. Maybe the whole I think, but that maybe just my personal point. I think the blind watchmaker argument, I'm not too convinced by that because nature is so complex that small derivations are basically tolerable. So maybe it's more like an over-engineered German watch that has many different parts, some of which you don't even need, and you take an to compare American tank to German Tiger tank. The Tiger tanks were perfectly engineered, but they broke down every second, and the American tanks, they were much more easily to handle, right? They weren't as capable as the German tanks, but they were more robust, right? I think that's the word I'm looking for. There's robustness in species, right? If you have a mutation, then the species still doesn't fall apart. But that brings you to another question. Then then to go from one species to another will take an even longer time, right? Because you now have to go through mutating 200 different proteins in one mechanism, right? So if only like 10 of those genes are really crucial for a biological process to work, then mutating that process is almost impossible, right?
Well,
So
yeah.
that's what I would say that would make it more difficult to explain life from purely evolutionary standpoint.